Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. I said last week with the Apple event that we are going to have a lot to cover this week because of all of the various Homelab improvements, upgrades, hardware swaps, software installs, all that stuff that was going on. And boy, oh boy, do we have a lot. New hardware, swapped out hardware, installed new things on old hardware. There's a lot to get into, so we're going to get into that this week. But before we do that, let's start off with our trivia question. And this trivia question is probably going to be one of the easiest we've done. Even if you aren't tech savvy, if you've listened to the podcast for long enough, you'll probably have heard the term that I'm going to mention for the trivia question, and hopefully you'll be able to get this one right this week. So hopefully I'm giving you guys a softball this week, since I know we kind of have a history of giving really tough ones. So with that out of the way, here is your trivia question for the week. What does LAN stand for in the context of networking? And LAN being spelled L-A-N. So what does LAN stand for in the context of networking? Hopefully you're already blurting out the answer, but we'll get to that at the end of the podcast. So I need to make a quick announcement before we get into our cybersecurity tip, and that is any of you out there that are developers or just Homelabbers in general, and you roll your own self-hosted GitLab instance, you need to make sure you're updating and make sure you're updated ASAP, because there was a software critical vulnerability rating at a 9.6 on the CVSS score, so that's out of 10, so obviously pretty high. It's CVE 2023 5009. So basically what happens with this vulnerability is an attacker would be able to run pipelines as another user. So that's not good. Now, I guess on the one hand, if you are self-hosting your own GitLab instance and you don't have any runners configured, this probably isn't really an issue because you need to have runners in order to run pipelines. I talked about getting a GitLab runner set up in my Homelab a few weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago. I don't know. It's been a little bit. But yeah, if you try to run a pipeline without a GitLab runner on a self-hosted instance of GitLab, it just won't work. Now, if you try to run a pipeline on GitLab.com, they have their own runners and stuff all set up that you can just use their runners, and it's not really that big of a deal. But you can also use your own runners too if you'd prefer that method. But anyway, regardless, so this vulnerability affects running pipelines. So as far as affected versions, GitLab Enterprise Edition versions starting from 13.12 prior to 16.2.7, as well as 16.3 before 16.3.4. So those are the affected versions. Now, as far as how do you check what version of GitLab you have running, if you go to your self-hosted instance of GitLab, you go to the web portal. So say your domain for GitLab is, GitLab at homelab.local or something. Say that's your domain for your GitLab instance. If you go to gitlab.homelab.local/help and then you make sure that you're signed in to whatever your account is on your local instance of GitLab, you should see the GitLab Enterprise Edition version that you're running. And if it's in one of those affected ranges, make sure you do an update as soon as possible to make sure that you get that patched, because GitLab has pushed a patch for this vulnerability, so you definitely want to make sure that you update to it. So basically, going a little bit more into the vulnerability itself, it's basically so in the process of running these pipelines as an arbitrary user, they can do things like schedule security scan policies. Basically, a successful exploitation of this vulnerability would allow a threat actor to access sensitive information or leverage an elevated permissions of the impersonated user to modify source code or run arbitrary code on the system. So again, the whole running arbitrary code on a remote system, I mean, that's like definition of one of the worst types of vulnerabilities out there. So you definitely want to make sure that you get this patched, because especially if they can run their arbitrary code as, say, a root user, or in other words, the user that whatever they say is basically gospel and law, and the OS will obey without any question and do it. So if you, for example, one of the kind of like on Windows when they jokingly say the best way to speed up your computer is to delete the System32 folder. Basically, the Linux equivalent of that is do a rm-rf star from \. So basically remove the entire file system. Now, you will run into some errors if you try to do this, but your system will be bricked. Now, I obviously don't recommend doing it on your actual system, but if you want to play around with it, you can always spin up a quick virtual machine with a quick Linux install, and then just go to the root of the file system, which is \, and then just do a sudo rm-rf and watch the magic happen. Or I guess it would be rm/rf star to make sure that you delete everything, because obviously you got to have the wildcard in there, and then the -r obviously being recursive, and the -f to be forced. So there you go if you want to mess up a Linux system. But yeah, so arbitrary code execution, not a good time. So make sure that you get your GitLab instances patched. So just as a reminder, if you are on version 16.3.4 or 16.2.7, you are good to go. Otherwise, you want to make sure that you update. So that is just kind of a PSA. And with that, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. So for this week's cybersecurity tip, this is another one of those things that you should just kind of check to make sure. I think generally this is disabled by default, but one thing that you should do is to ensure that your global IP address is not pingable. And you can do this by going into your router's configuration settings. So if you have your ISP's router or whatever, you're using their default one, or if you have your own, there's ways that you can set this. It's probably most likely somewhere in the firewall settings, or maybe in the advanced settings or the security settings, somewhere in there, and there'll be something like allow ping from WAN or something like that. And basically what that'll do is it'll turn off the ability for your IP address to be pingable. And what I mean by pingable is if you're on the command line, right, and you just type ping and then like the name of an IP address, or not the name of an IP address. If you type in an IP address, it'll try to ping that host just to see if it's up or not. It'll do like an echo reply thing to see if the host is up. And you can also do this for domain names as well. You could do a ping google.com. see if Google's up. That's kind of one of the easy go-tos as far as checking if you have network access for a couple reasons. One, because it forces you to use DNS, and as some people like to say in the tech space, it's always DNS. So if you have any kind of network issues, might be DNS, because if you just type an IP address, you don't have to do the whole DNS process because you don't have to resolve a domain at all. So if you already have the IP address, so that's why, pinging an actual domain to check if you have internet access is, a good check to verify that. That you have, well, one, I guess that you have internet access, but two, your DNS is good. But some other reasons why you would want to disable ping from WAN and disable, we'll get to that before I trip over my words. So one of the reasons why you'd want to disable it is to try to prevent hackers from knowing where you are, and also potentially to prevent distributed denial of service attacks or DDoS attacks. And the reason this is because if you're constantly getting pinged by ping requests and your router is constantly sending replies, if enough bots swarm you with ping requests, it's feasible to see that you might lose internet connection and get a denial of service on you because your router's too busy responding to all these ping requests that it can't actually handle your legit traffic. Now, why anyone would want to DDoS you, not exactly sure, but I mean, you never know, I guess. I guess if you're a high-profile individual, I guess you'd probably know that, which is, I guess, another reason why you never want to actually reveal your global IP address to the broader internet. I mean, obviously, whenever you're searching the internet, using a web browser, using anything on the internet, your global IP address is exposed. But in regards to letting, normal individuals know what your global IP address is rather than, the web server or app or whatever that you're connecting to, that's a little bit different. So another reason why you'd want to disable ping from WAN is because ping uses what's known as an ICMP packet. ICMP standing for Internet Control Message Protocol. So there's a couple different ways that this can be used. There are also various ways that this can be used for malicious reasons. So just blocking ICMP packets outright can be a way to defend against this. Now, there are ways that you could set up like an intrusion detection system or prevention system to do some like packet identification, identify the signatures of types of packets that are doing malicious things with ICMP. But your standard basic firewall of like disabling ports, your classic, I'm not going to allow anyone to access, XYZ ports or whatever, isn't going to do anything because ICMP by default doesn't really use ports at all. Now you can send ICMP packets to specific ports to see if you get a response, and kind of do some reconnaissance that way to see if a specific host has any ports open to kind of be under the radar. And then there's also other things that you can do too, like tunneling, ICMP tunneling. If you want a little more information on that, you can look up Loki, not the Marvel character. If you look up Loki ICMP, you'll basically be the first result there. But basically how the tunneling works in a nutshell is the ICMP packet transmits a small amount of data inside the packet in the reply portion of the packet. So because ICMP is generally known as like the ping command, right? It's the ping, right? It's harmless. There's nothing bad here. What you could do is you could put whatever data you want inside the data portion of the ICMP packet and do that for your transmission, and basically bypass, firewalls and intrusion detection or prevention systems, and kind of do some sneaky stuff that way. Although in more recent years, for example, low-key, like I mentioned, modern like intrusion detection systems and prevention systems generally should have signatures to be able to detect those kinds of packets if they're being sent. So you shouldn't really have to worry about that, but it is something to be aware of that could potentially happen with ICMP. So if you just disable it outright and don't allow, people to send you ICMP packets. Obviously, if you sent out one, receiving one, that's a little bit different. But as far as being asked to send a reply message, that's obviously a different scenario. Now, you can also configure this to, like if you have a cloud server or something running in the cloud, like AWS, Linode, Azure, any of the other cloud providers out there, you should also be able to disable ICMP packets on there too, if you so choose. Probably have to do that. You could, depending on the cloud provider, you could either try to do something in the actual firewall settings that kind of covers your infrastructure, if you will. So for some cloud providers, for example, you can have a firewall set up so all of your VPSs or virtual private servers that you have running with that cloud provider can be behind that firewall, so you can have like one common firewall for all your servers, so you don't necessarily have to go through the process of configuring your IP tables or firewall D or whatever firewall solution you're going with. You can just have kind of like a global firewall, or I guess in reality you should have the layered approach, right, where you have the global firewall, if you will, from the cloud provider, and then each one of your different virtual servers or VPSs in the cloud would have their own firewalls configured as well. But you could potentially mix and match on how you want to enable that or whatever if you so choose. So as far as the ICMP messages and different attacks that you can use, I'll have a link down in the show notes if you want to do a little more looking into that. But that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Now we get into the fun stuff. At least I think it's the fun stuff. That, of course, being what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week? Or I guess really the past couple weeks, since we didn't do this last week. But one thing that I have talked about on the podcast before is you should always, one, keep good backups. The 3-2-1 backup strategy, which, me being the hypocrite that I am, don't actually have a good, reliable off-site backup. I did say I'm working on that, and I still am working on that. I think I have identified a solution. I just really haven't gotten my butt in gear to actually implement it, but I have a solution strategy. It's just a matter of me actually going through and implementing it. But as part of backups, I mentioned a couple weeks ago, I think it was, that if you don't test your backups are just wishful thinking, right? Like if you don't actually test to ensure your backups work, it's just wishful thinking. Well, I tested my backups twice this past couple weeks, unintentionally, of course, due to me living up to my self-proclaimed nickname of a code monkey who occasionally breaks stuff in his Homelab, because I broke stuff. Of course, I did, because I do that from time to time. So the first thing I did was I was trying to reconfigure one of my VMs in Proxmox. And as part of that, I don't really know what I was thinking. And I've tried to rationalize how I might have been thinking, but just nothing makes sense. Because I was trying to resize the storage on Proxmox, and rather than adding like an extra disk, I tried to just resize the disk. And one issue with resizing disks is it's not exactly easy to undo a resize of a disk. Now, I guess you could probably kind of hack it and like go into the config settings like through the command line or whatever and change that value. But depending on how you have your OS configured, that could royally mess things up. So yeah, so I'm not exactly sure what I was thinking. But when I was going to resize, I was trying to give the VM 100 gigabytes of extra data. But I decided that I was like, 100 gigabytes, yeah, I'll just put in 1024 because that's the number I need. So I'm not even sure why I thought that, because it's not like it was megabytes, because 1024 megabytes is obviously not 100 gigabytes, and 1024 gigabytes is obviously not 100 gigabytes. So I really don't know what I was thinking. I just kind of had a total brain fart there. And so rather than giving the VM an extra 100 gigabytes, I gave it an extra terabyte. And I was like, I did not want to do that. And I didn't have really any way to roll that change back. So I decided to go the nuclear option and restore the VM from a backup that I had. And sure enough, after the restoration process complete, everything worked like it was supposed to, thus verifying that my backup actually worked. So I was pretty happy to see that. But of course, that's not the only thing that I messed up in this past couple weeks, because one thing that I was trying to do was, so I have basically a spreadsheet to keep track of the idle power draw of various devices in my Homelab. And one thing I was trying to do was test the idle power draw of my switches to see how much power they drew, because that's one thing. Out of all the devices that I've tested, I haven't tested the switches, partly because if I unplug the switch turns off, and all those devices connected to it are no longer accessible. So that's obviously not exactly ideal. But you'll notice the key point there, which I obviously wasn't thinking about at the time. But the key point there being, if you unplug the switch, all devices connect to it are no longer accessible. And the reason why this is important is because the spreadsheet that I was using to edit, right, where I kept the spreadsheet, was on my NAS. And my NAS is connected to one of my switches. So when I unplugged the switch, I lost connection to my NAS. And then when I replugged it back in, the connection came back up. But then when I was trying to save it, I ran into some conflict issues and it not being able to connect to the NAS, and then there was a whole thing I guess I didn't read correctly, and I thought I saved it, but in reality I didn't, and completely nuked the file, and it was gone. And I was like, well, this is fantastic, because I don't want to have to redo this file. And then I remembered that on my NAS, because I'm running TrueNAS and it uses ZFS, I have snapshots. So my NAS takes periodic snapshots, which basically a snapshot, if you're unfamiliar, is basically a point in time. So if you end up deleting a file, it's not technically gone because you have the snapshot still pointing to it in memory, because as we've talked about before, Because you delete a file does not mean it's actually gone. Really, what's happening, I guess on SSDs it's a little bit different, but for your standard spinning Rust storage, when you delete a file, you don't actually delete the file. What you're doing is you're basically just telling the operating system, hey, this file doesn't exist, don't point to it, remove any references to it, this space is free. So the data is still technically there, it's just not accessible by the operating system. And in the future, the operating system could end up writing over that data and essentially either corrupting it or deleting it with a new file potentially. But how snapshots work is while the main operating system doesn't point to that value anymore, you still have the snapshot which still has a pointer to that file location. So when you roll back to the previous snapshot that still has the pointer to that file, your file is miraculously back, which it's not really miraculous at all because it's just, actually has the pointer to where that file is located on the system. So because of all of that, I was able to restore from one of my previous snapshots to get the file back, able to copy it out of the snapshot, put it back into the main directory, and then go on my merry way. Now, obviously, it wasn't as updated as I wanted it to be because I was doing some other changes on the file earlier in the day, so it wasn't 100% updated, but adding a couple extra data points rather than redoing the entire spreadsheet was definitely a great improvement. So there is another instance of where my backups saved my bacon and me unintentionally testing them to make sure that they worked. So that was that. And another weird quirk issue thing that I had gets us into some of the hardware upgrades that I did. So I decided to replace the two desktops that I have running in my Homelab, specifically that HP desktop that I was using as my router and my trusty Optiplex 7010. I decided to retire them and instead put in a new desktop to replace them, this being a Optiplex 5050, the tower version, and partly for efficiency, but also for better performance and whatnot. But anyway, I had bought a RAM kit to basically max out the RAM. So in this case, it was 64 gigs. And I also bought a new PCIe card, which was a 4-port network card, so I could have it act as my router and also have additional network ports for additional VMs and stuff, so not everything's on one port. But I ran into a rather peculiar issue. I could run with 64 gigs of RAM, or I could run with the PCIe card installed, but not both, which was really odd. If I unplugged the RAM stick in the third DIMM slot, it would work fine. But if I had that populated, it just wouldn't boot, and it would give me an error message, which it wasn't an error message, it was like a blinking amber light, which I was able to decode that it was saying that there was a memory corruption issue or like some memory issue with like the memory modules, which was weird because I knew all the memory was fine, so I'm not exactly sure why it was giving me that issue. But regardless, it wouldn't boot with 4 RAM sticks and the network card installed. I don't know why. The consensus from the single forum post that I found on Dell's website really had no resolution whatsoever from Dell, but the consensus was there was an issue between the Dell BIOS and the firmware that was on the card. So why removing one of the RAM sticks fixes the issue, I honestly couldn't tell you. But the other thing that was also interesting was if I put other cards, like other PCIe cards in the slot, like for example, I tried to put a GPU in there. It worked perfectly fine with the 64 gigs. So I guess there was something between the firmware on the network card and the BIOS. I don't know. But so that was kind of a bummer, that I had to lose some RAM there. But at the end of the day, I can't really complain too much because this one system is replacing two systems, and the two systems it's replacing combined had 36 gigs of RAM. So while I'm not maxed out at the 64 like I wanted to be, it's still a net positive amount of RAM, so I guess I can't complain too much. But it was just a really weird issue because here I was thinking, oh, I'll just slap in the PCIe card, boot the thing up, and it'll be good to go. And of course that didn't happen, because why would it happen? It'll happen as it's supposed to. So yeah, that was rather peculiar. But I mentioned that I was decommissioning the Optiplex 7010, which has been a trusty addition to my Homelab since the very beginning. It was the first device that I ever purchased for my Homelab before I even knew Homelabbing was a thing. I just wanted a server that could run Linux, and I thought it'd be cool to have a server. This was back in the day. And it actually, back when I first got it, it actually served as an offsite backup for me because I was at college at the time, and I basically had this server at my parents' house. So it basically kind of served as, one, having a server, and two, kind of sort of an offsite backup, if you will. Now, I didn't necessarily update the backup probably as much as I should have, but, I guess I still had it. But anyway, it would kind of, in a way, feel wrong to get rid of it because it's still a solid machine. I mean, it's no slouch, in my opinion, by any stretch of the imagination. But so I decided to give it I don't know how many numbers we're up to, new view on life, or whatever the phrase is, because first it was just a straight Ubuntu system. Then it was I forget what I turned it into after that. I turned it into something else, and then I think I bought a GPU for it and kind of had it mining cryptocurrency for a little while. And then I turned it into a hypervisor, and now I did what I'm doing now, which was converting it into a one-way trip to Nostalgiaville. Because why would I let this machine with a i7 3770, 32 gigs of RAM, and an RX 550 go to waste? Because obviously that's still some pretty decent hardware for what it is. So I decided to take it to Nostalgiaville. And what I mean by that is I decided to install Windows 7 on it, and also install some classic games, some classic PC games from the Windows 95 to XP era. And if you're wondering if I'm running games from the Windows 95 to XP era, why aren't I using XP or Windows 98 or Windows 95? And the main reason is hardware compatibility, because this system, I believe, shipped with Windows 7. I'm pretty sure there's a Windows 7 sticker on it, like the product serial key or whatever, for installing Windows. And the reason hardware compatibility is important is because you need driver support. So for those who aren't aware, drivers are basically the things that allow your software, in this case your operating system, to talk to your hardware. In this case, the CPU, graphics card, RAM, all that stuff. So, well, I guess maybe not RAM, but mouse, keyboard, all that stuff. So if you don't have the proper drivers installed, you're at best going to be running with suboptimal performance, and at worst, you're not going to be able to run at all, or that device that you're trying to plug in or use or whatever is not going to work. So Windows 7 was kind of I don't know necessarily the only choice I had, but it was the best choice as far as hardware compatibility is concerned. But in addition to that, while Windows 7 obviously is not supported anymore, it did have a much longer run as far as security updates goes than anything else like Windows XP, Windows 98, or 95 even. But that's not really the main reason. The main reason I kind of wanted to do Windows 7 over Windows 10 or 11, well, technically speaking, Windows 11 isn't supported on there. But I have had Windows 11 running on there natively just fine in the past. But that was more of just kind of testing to see if I could do it, because I heard people saying that you couldn't, and I wanted to try to see if I could actually do it. But anyway, one of the reasons I did put Windows 7 on there was it's kind of sort of modern-ish. I guess I'll put that in air quotes. But also, in my experience, it has really good compatibility for playing these older games. Because I know specifically growing up, when I used to play these games, obviously starting on the older Windows systems like 98, XP, that kind of a thing, and then when we got a new computer with Windows Vista and Windows 7 on it, played fine on those operating systems as well. But then kind of once the switch to Windows 10 happened, the compatibility kind of stopped. Now I know there's like a compatibility feature within Windows that you can like run various applications in certain compatibility modes. But I always found that Windows 7 was just a really good sweet spot for compatibility with older games, yet also newer to still be able to run some more modern software. Like you can still get, technically it's not the latest version of Firefox, but like you can get basically their equivalent of like the long-term support stuff that's still at least getting updates for a little while longer, I think. And there's still some other more newer versions of software that you can install versus something like a Windows XP or Windows 95 or 98 or something. So those were some other reasons. But anyway, one thing that I also made sure to do when I installed the AMD driver was to enable basically every kind of upscaling feature there was that I could enable. And man, did these late 90s and early 2000s games look super crisp. Like, these graphics, yeah, they were kind of blocky, and, you know, the details weren't like, you know, modern games, but like the clarity was just so darn clear. It, like, especially at 1080p, and yes, even at 4K. Because I hooked this thing up to my 4K TV, and man, it looked pretty darn good. Another thing I also did was when I was trying to troubleshoot some compatibility for some of these games, one of the games in particular that I was trying to play, specifically the splash screen, if you will, and like the main menu kind of had some artifacting to it. So I was trying to play around with the compatibility settings. It wasn't really working. So then I tried to install Windows XP in a VM to try to see if that would fix anything. And it kind of did, but it kind of didn't. It fixed the artifacting I saw, but it like shrunk the screen no matter, even if I tried to hard set the resolution. But anyway, when I had my computer hooked up to the 4K TV, I decided to boot up Windows XP, and man, Windows XP in 4K looks pretty darn good, I must say. And that rhymed. I didn't plan on it rhyming, but it did. So I guess that's kind of cool. But yeah, so now whenever I want to take a one-way trip to Nostalgiaville, I can just boot up the old Optiplex 7010 and just go ham on some classic games. And if I really want to go ham on the old school theme, I can plug in my PS2 Model M keyboard and PS2 mouse as well and really complete the aesthetic. I guess really at this point all I would need is do like a case swap for the Optiplex and put it in some like beige box, and then get one of those like big old beige CRT monitors and just completely complete the setup. But I kind of like the way it is as it is. But that's that. Now getting over to some software related things. So this is also kind of infrastructure related. But one thing that I did this week was I switched over my VPN solution. So previously I was using OpenVPN, and I still technically have it running in my Homelab just kind of as a backup while I'm testing out my new solution, which is WireGuard. Now, I had heard about WireGuard for a while, and what kind of really drove me to potentially trying to switch to it was I heard how much faster WireGuard is. Like, oh, it's so much faster than OpenVPN and whatnot. So I decided that I would give it a try. And to my amazement, and I've been quite impressed with the speed capabilities, and I pretty much noticed it right away that the speed improvement was quite noticeable. In some cases, like twice as fast as the OpenVPN solution that I was running. So that was pretty darn impressive. So I have been quite pleased with this transition. But one thing that I will say about WireGuard, which is, I guess, part of its design, is it can be deceptive at times. Because unlike OpenVPN, which establishes a connection between you and the server, WireGuard doesn't do that. So WireGuard strictly uses UDP, which is, if you are familiar with some of the episodes we've done on some various networking topics, UDP is essentially the fire and forget methodology. Like, I don't care if you're listening, here is data packets. Whereas TCP is kind of the opposite. TCP does like a handshake to make sure that the data got transmitted, and if it doesn't get transmitted, it'll try to retransmit it to make sure that all the data arrives. So because WireGuard uses UDP, this whole fire and forget methodology, sometimes it'll say you're connected when in reality you're not. So I've had it happen a couple times where, like, I'll toggle on the toggle to connect to the VPN, and immediately it'll be like, yep, you're connected, good to go. And then I'll try to, search for something, and I'll just get a loading bar that doesn't move, and I'll be like, well, I guess I'm not connected, am I? And sure enough, I wasn't. Now, in fairness, since I actually got things configured properly now, I generally really haven't had that issue happen. But when I was first configuring things, I ran into it fairly often as I was trying to get things configured. But it does add to the appeal of WireGuard that it's supposed to be quote-unquote silent, in the sense that the only traffic that goes between you and the VPN server is when you're actively trying to use it, and not any kind of heartbeat or handshake constant message back and forth. So that kind of adds to the silent aspect of it. But yeah, it can be deceptive, saying that you're connected when in reality you're not, which I never had this issue with OpenVPN for kind of obvious reasons, because OpenVPN kind of does does TCP handshake thing. So if you can't actually connect to the server, it won't say you're connected. So rather than the VPN saying that I'm connected, only for me to then realize as I try to access various internet things, not being able to, OpenVPN would just fail to connect and let me know that it couldn't connect to the server. So that is one thing to note if you're kind of debating between WireGuard and OpenVPN. Just because WireGuard says you're connected doesn't necessarily mean that you are. So if once you do connect to WireGuard, it's probably best practice to make sure that you actually test your connection to make sure that you are connected and things are working as you intended them to. So just kind of, I guess, a word of caution there. And I guess one other quick thing on the semi-software related, but also a little bit of infrastructure. We talked about GitLab in the beginning of the episode, and one thing that GitLab has, which other Git solutions have too, is the ability to create a wiki in your repository. So rather than creating a specific wiki inside of one of my repositories, I decided to just create a brand new one specifically for a wiki, this being a Homelab wiki, which my goal is to actually do what I should have been doing all along, which is better documenting my processes for configuring various services, virtual machines, all that good stuff. Because one thing in home labbing that you'll find is sometimes when you're trying to configure a service or set up a VM with specific capabilities, hardware pass-through, GPU pass-through, things like that, it can be sometimes a little tedious and a lot of steps that you kind of have to remember, and sometimes it'll take you a while to figure that out, having to search various forums, videos, question answer posts, all kinds of different places trying to figure out how to do stuff. So ideally it would be nice if you kind of documented how you did it. So if and or when you have to do it again, you don't have to spend all those hours trying to remember how you did it in the first place. You can just go right to the guide you wrote up for yourself and follow it and get it knocked out in a fairly short amount of time in comparison. So I have done that a little bit for some things. One of the most notable things that I had done previously was I had set up a certificate for my personal email account so I can have signed messages be sent, and I can also send encrypted emails. And as part of that process, I've had to renew the cert, I think, twice now. And whenever I had to renew it, I always had to remind myself what the heck I was supposed to do in order to renew it, because it's so long in between when I have to renew it. So I decided this past time, when I went to renew it, to actually write up some documentation on how to go about doing it. So when I have to do it again in the future, I can just go back to that doc, follow the steps, and knock it out no problem. So that's kind of what I plan to do going forward, and just kind of adding to this wiki and kind of make it a growing living document, I guess, if you will. And another thing that I threw in there, just because I happened to be working on it at the time, making a wiki, I wanted to have a direct link through DNS, a direct URL that I could use to access the wiki without having to type in the obscenely long URL for the GitLab repo and all that stuff. So I decided to just use my proxy service that I had set up. And I thought, why not if I just, go ahead here and write up the process for adding a new proxy service, to, how to add a new one. So I wrote up some documentation for that. And also the plus, I guess, of, writing up documentation like that too, is there's supposed to be I don't remember the exact thing, but there's supposed to be like a psychology principle that, like, if you write something down, it helps you remember it more. And also another thing, like, teaching something like helps you better learn it yourself. So kind of going through the process of writing it down in a manner that you can understand and potentially teach it, I guess, back to yourself as you're writing it down can help you remember that process. So maybe you won't even have to use your documentation in the future. But if you need to, it's there. And I guess also, if you want to get super morbid here for a second, if you end up, passing away for whatever reason, and some poor soul has to inherit your home lab, chances are they're probably going to have no idea what to do with it. So if you have some kind of wiki or written documentation kind of going through like the basics of how to do some stuff that could potentially be beneficial to them. That's obviously assuming they don't just sell all your stuff right away, which theoretically could happen, but it is what it is. So that's why I kind of wanted to start that, just to kind of document my process better and kind of include things. But with how many services and virtual machines and all that I've spun up, it honestly is way too overwhelming to go and write all those processes now. Plus, there are some things that I set up that I probably couldn't even write the documentation for. So I decided that how I'm going to do this is go about it like I did my password management when I first set up my self-hosted Bitwarden instance. That being, do it as I go. So as I install new services or as I try to do something else, whether that's Homelab related or say installing something on an old operating system or whatever the case may be, do the documentation process as I go along and add to the wiki as I do stuff and slowly build it up over time to make it more manageable and not so overwhelming. So that is the wiki process. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about, which brings us finally up to the present day as of the recording, because I literally just got this all configured and set up and put into operation last night, is I got a new switch. So another one, I know I have 3 now, but 2 of them, the 2 that were previously in my rack, are now no longer in my rack, which a little bit of irony here. Usually when you consolidate your hardware, you would think that you would also decrease the overall power draw, right? I mean, it makes sense. You have less things plugged in, less things running, so it should draw less power. Well, that's not the case, but we'll get into that in a little bit. But the switch that I got was the Brocade ICX 6540 48P, code name The Beef Snack. And if you're familiar with the Serve the Home forum thread on the subject of the Brocade switches, you'll completely understand that codename reference. But I guess a little bit of decoding of the name, the -48P stands for 48 ports of PoE+, which, for a little bit of context, the 2 switches I was using previously, one was a TP-Link switch and one was a Netgear switch. Both of those were 24 ports, so in total 48 ports. So have the same number of ports as before, now just in one switch. And neither of those switches, the Netgear or the TP-Link, had any kind of PoE capability. So no PoE, no PoE+, no PoE++, none of that. And when I'm saying PoE, in case you're not aware of what that stands for Power over Ethernet. So there's a couple various standards. Like I mentioned, there's PoE, which is kind of the base. There's PoE+, and then PoE++. And basically the main difference between them is how much power can be delivered through the Ethernet port. Now, I don't remember all the numbers offhand, so apologies for that, but I want to say it's something like standard PoE is, honestly, I'm not even going to say because I'll probably mess it up. But just know, PoE is one amount of wattage, and then PoE Plus is more than that, and then PoE Plus Plus is even more than that. So this is a PoE Plus capable switch, capable of delivering 740 watts, I believe, so quite a bit of juice. I don't have any PoE devices at the moment. I have been debating, actually, now that I have this PoE Plus switch, to actually put it into use and get one of those adapter hats for my Raspberry Pi that can allow it to use PoE and power it that way rather than having a Ethernet cable and a power cable going into it. So that might be something I try in the future. But in addition to the 48 ports of PoE Plus gigabit capabilities, It also has 4 SFP plus 10 gigabit ports. So that is an improvement over my previous infrastructure, which only had 2 SFP plus ports. So that is a bonus. It also has a couple of management ports. One is a serial port, which I actually had to use in order to configure it, and the other one's just a management port, which I don't use. But the serial port I also don't use anymore because I managed to get it configured, so now I can SSH into it and manage stuff from the command line if I want to, or I also have the web interface enabled. So as I mentioned, I did get it configured, but one quick word of caution. If you are interested in getting into the Brocade switches, you will need to configure them, because chances are, if you're getting, like in my case, the switch that I got, not all of the functionality is enabled by default, because these are enterprise grade switches. Enterprise likes to do shenanigans, specifically restricting what you can use unless you pay a decent chunk of money in order to unlock the features. Kind of like what some car companies are doing now, where they provide all the features like in the car, which in the one hand makes it easier for them because it's, streamlines the production process. But then on the other hand, you have to pay additional money to enable the heated seats, even though your car already has heated seats, but you didn't pay for that upgrade, so they just disable it in software. Kind of similar thing here. So enterprises do that as well with their switches. So the Brocade switch here is no different. Out of the box, I know for a fact that 2 of the SFP plus ports were disabled, but I did manage through the configuration process to get them enabled. Going back to that Serve the Home forum post thread that I talked about, there's a link there that has an entire guide on how to configure these things. So it's really not that hard if you follow the guide. So it's pretty easy to do. But if you want to see in action, kind of how this functionality can be locked out, search Craft Computing's video on his 40 gigabit server rack fail, and you'll see this in action of how if you don't properly configure these switches, you can think you're getting an amazing deal, but in reality, you're locked out of all the cool stuff that you thought you were getting. So that is one kind of word of caution. But like I said, there's a walkthrough online that is super easy to follow. At least I thought it was pretty easy to follow. It's pretty much assuming you have the right equipment for it. It's pretty much copy and paste commands, more or less. And the really nice thing is the guy that provided the guide also provided a free license key for you to use if you wanted to do that. So you can get it licensed and get all the functionality unlocked, which was pretty nice. But so yeah, it's basically it's not like the TP-Link switch or the Netgear switch I had previously, which was literally I just plugged it in and it was ready to go. Aside from maybe having to figure out what the IP address was and then configure the IP address, aside from that, it was literally plug and play. So the Brocade switches aren't quite that way, but they do offer a lot of functionality too, which I do hopefully plan on trying to get into in the future. But like I said, I literally just got it installed in my rack last night, so I really haven't had too much time to really play around with it. Part of that was because the fans. Now, if you're familiar with enterprise gear, you'll know it's not exactly the quietest. And if you're familiar with enterprise switches, you know they can be quite the screaming banshees. And this Brocade switch was no different. It was very loud. Now once it got down to idle, it was still pretty loud. Like if I was downstairs, watching TV or something, and the air conditioner wasn't running, I could hear the switch upstairs at idle. So it's not exactly quiet. Like it was It was basically it could go a few rounds with my Xserve. I'll say that. So at its loudest, it could easily compete with the Xserve when the Xserve is first booting up, and they could probably go a few rounds for what's the loudest thing. But the nice thing about having a screaming banshee is that means you're pushing a lot of air. And man, if you put your hand behind that switch, you could probably blow dry your hair. Like, there was a ton of air coming out of that thing. So temperature-wise, it was running barely above ambient. Like, ambient temperature in my house, it was a couple degrees Celsius higher than that, but not by much. Now, granted, there was nothing plugged in at the time, but still, I mean, that's I guess it's impressive, but at the same time, it shouldn't be all that shocking because of how much air was moving through this thing. So I decided that I don't want to have this thing running this loud. So I'm going to try to figure out how I can modify this. So again, kind of going back to the Serve the Home forum thread on the subject, one common thing to do with these Brocade switches is do a fan mod, which basically you swap out the stock fans with different fans that are quieter. So I decided to do this. I put in 3 new Delta fans, which also kind of as a word of warning, if you plan on doing the fan mod, there's a decent chance the fans you get won't work out of the box. And really the main solution that I found was I found a video of a guy doing a fan mod on YouTube, and what he did was he swapped, in his case, I think it was the red and black wire, I think, or maybe it was the red and yellow wire. I don't remember. It was whichever wires were on the edges. It's a 3 wire configuration, the ones that were on the edges. He basically swapped them, and that got it to work. And similarly, when the fans that I got, when I plugged them in, they didn't work, did that swap, and they worked fine. So that is another thing to keep in mind. If you plan on getting one of these switches and doing a fan mod, you might have to swap the wires around. But I mean, if you get like a flathead screwdriver to kind of stick in there, push down the pin and pull the wires out, it's not all that hard to do. But anyway, these new fans, the Delta fans, are whisper quiet. Even at max fan speed, like when the switch first boots up, they're still quieter by a decent margin than the stock fans were at idle speeds. So definitely a significant improvement. Now, one thing that I guess should be obvious here is because they aren't nearly as loud, means they're not running at as high of an RPM, which means the amount of air they're moving is not as high, which I guess should be obvious. But unsurprisingly, because of this, the switch runs hotter, and kind of by a significant margin. Now, granted, I say significant margin, but it's still within spec. But I guess at the same time, if you say something is running significantly hotter, if your baseline for temperatures is more or less ambient room temperature, and then you're going up to like standard running temperatures of like electronics of like CPUs and whatnot, I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, another thing that I guess I should point out here is I'm not, like I mentioned, I'm not using any of the PoE capability, so I'm not drawing excess power and therefore excess heat to power those devices. And I'm also not using a ton of the SFP Plus ports. I'm only using one of them at the moment. So if I was fully loaded on the SFP Plus and was using a ton of PoE, yeah, doing the fan mod probably wouldn't be a smart idea, since it would be thrown into question if the new fans could actually keep the switch cool. I'm not 100% sure how cool it could keep it with the fans running at max speed, since how it stands right now, the fans running at idle speed are able to keep it within its threshold of I keep you at idle speed or I put you at max. So I'm not exactly sure the full cooling capability, so I could probably have some wiggle room. but because noise is kind of a driving factor of my home lab, seeing that I have to exist in the same room as it a decent amount of the time, I like it to be somewhat quiet, but I do admit if I ever get to the point where I have it in its own dedicated room, or I have it stuck in the basement or a garage or some dedicated space where I don't necessarily have to be around it all the time, I would consider putting the stock fans back in. But with that said, I have been impressed. Impressed with the sound improvement for sure, because now I can't even hear it. Even if nothing is plugged in and the switch is the only thing plugged in, it's still really, really quiet. So that was definitely a big improvement. Now, I mentioned this at the beginning when I first started talking about the switch, that ironically, I don't know if downsizing is the right word, but going from 2 switches to 1 switch, ironically, increased my power consumption. Basically by almost double. So oops on that. But technically, and here's where the copium comes in. So here's where I take a large injection of copium to try to justify this to myself. So while yes, the switch by itself technically draws like 2 to 3 times as much power as my other 2 switches combined. Yes, that is a fact. But if you'll recall, in the beginning of the episode, I mentioned that I bought that new Optiplex 5050 tower to replace 2 desktops. So really, I took out those 2 switches, but I also removed 2 desktops as well. Each of those drawing around like 26, 27 watts each. So granted, the new desktop draws, I think, around like 26 watts, but still, that's like 26, 27 watts less than what I was drawing previously. Plus, I'm removing the 2 switches, which I think was like 21 and 13 watts respectively or something like that. So that puts me at around 61 watts less than what I was using with my other setup. So based on my kilowatt readings of the Brocade switch, it was drawing about 79 watts, so a little bit more power. But that 79 watts was also with nothing plugged in. Now, I almost made the dumb mistake of not realizing my kilowatt was on the wrong setting and thought it was drawing 150 watts of power with everything plugged in. But thankfully, I just had the setting wrong. And with everything plugged in, it was more like 91 watts, which again, 61 watts to 91 watts, that's an extra 30 watts. But again, I mean, compared to what it could be, right? It could have been significantly worse, but because I removed that other stuff, it's not nearly as bad. So that was my my copium there to try to cope with the fact that in my kind of goal here to reduce my power consumption, actually kind of sort of increased power consumption a little bit. But I did reduce, I guess, the number of devices plugged in, which has the added benefit of freeing up some much needed rack space. So now if I want to put in a new rack mounted server, I got some space for it. I'm not saying I'm going to, but I mean, you know me, so it's not necessarily a matter of if, but more of a matter of when. But I guess we'll see when that happens. But I'm still kind of the mindset that if I do end up getting a new server, at this point, it'll probably be a replacement for my R510, my NAS. Not because the R510 isn't good. It's been more than adequate. It's been performing spectacularly. But like I think I've mentioned in some previous episodes, it would be kind of nice if it just existing as hosting, my files and backups and all that stuff. it wasn't drawing 140-ish watts just sitting there. That would be kind of nice, but at the end of the day, it is cheaper to pay a power bill than it is to buy new hardware. So it is that never-ending debate. Plus, depending on which new hardware you get, while it could be more efficient, that doesn't necessarily mean it draws less power. So I've been still kind of going back and forth, but so I guess you're right. It's probably not a matter of if I get a new rack mount server, but more of a question of when. But based on kind of what I've been seeing, I haven't really necessarily seen anything that's kind of jumped out to me. So I say this, so I guess take it with a grain of salt that it'll probably be a little while yet, but I guess we'll end up seeing. So now that we're back to the present, that was a lot of nerdy stuff within the past couple weeks, and I think it's fitting that we finished talking about the nerdy stuff I did, talking about a switch, which handles a bunch of routing and switching on your network, specifically your LAN, which if you recall back to the very beginning of the podcast, we had our trivia question, which was asking, what does LAN stand for? So, like I mentioned here, the switch does a lot of stuff with your LAN. LAN, of course, being local area network. So if you said local area network for what LAN stands for, congratulations, you're right. Hopefully a good amount of you got that, because I know we've talked about LAN and local area networks before on the podcast. So hopefully this was an easier trivia question for most of you this week. And I know we kind of ran a little long on this one. We had a lot to catch up on. But that is going to be it for the episode. So if you enjoyed it, I ask that you leave a rating and review and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Also, if you or a friend or family member or that you know of has a Homelab, maybe looking for some interesting ideas for things to do, had a lot of various hardware and software that we talked about being implemented and upgraded to. So if someone's looking for ideas, maybe you could shoot them this episode. You could have some ideas for them in there. And if you have any questions or topics that you want covered in the podcast, you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. Link down in the show notes below, as always. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.